And now we're going to hear from Dahlman from Lund, who will talk to us about prior probability and the presumption of innocence.
Thanks, Phil, and of course, great thanks to the organizers. It's really a great privilege to be here and with all these great people, and I've had loads of very good conversations with many of you, which is reflected in the fact that my talk today isn't exactly what's in my paper that I uploaded before I came, so that shows that my thoughts on this have evolved during the week. My background is in law and philosophy. I have the chair in philosophy of law at Lund University, but since 2010 I'm directing a research group called LEVIC, Law, Evidence and Cognition, at Lund University, which is a cross-disciplinary research group with lawyers, philosophers, statisticians, cognitive psychologists. And what we do is similar to what Ulrike talked about this morning when she described the camp of people who are interested in the fallacies, the errors, the biases that legal decision makers, judges or jurors, make when they think about reason about evidence. So just like Ulrike said, we are, on the one hand, we are theoretical in the sense that we think about what they should do, what they ought to do, and on the other hand, we're experimental because we're investigating what they do and what fallacies they do commit. But today I'm going to talk about prior probability, or maybe it's better to call it the initial probability in a criminal trial, because it's a topic that has bothered me ever since I started to think about legal evidence. And so the first thing you need to do is to be aware of the framework in which legal evidence are assessed. It's not just a free enterprise with free fact finders, but it's actually a context with legal rules that condition and constrain what's going on. So this is how you can describe what the burden of proof in a criminal trial looks like. We have the prosecution's guy over here, and at the beginning of the trial, before any evidence is presented, there is some kind of point, which is in law often described as the presumption of innocence. Not very clear what it exactly means, where the prosecution has to start off from, and then has to produce evidence that transports the probability of guilt over to some kind of target point over here, in law described as the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. And of course it's important if you want to do a probabilistic analysis of this, to do it in a way that takes account of this framework. So what exactly is this starting condition, the presumption of innocence, and what exactly is the target? And because the method that we want to come up with of how the legal fact finders ought to think must not only respect probability theory, but must also respect this framework. So what I will be talking about is this here, the initial probability, the first prior, so to speak. So it's the situation at the beginning of a criminal trial where the only thing that has happened so far is that the prosecution has made a statement with regard to the criminal act as charged. So the defendant X strangled Y on February 5th in Cambridge, maybe at a certain location. And that is all we know as legal decision makers. So the question is, at that time, before any other evidence has been presented, at what probabilistic situation are we then? The important thing here is to understand is that at that point, the legal decision maker has general knowledge. This is something that Norman pointed out. For example, you have general knowledge about the world. So that goes into whatever is happening at that point. But you don't have any specific knowledge about the defendant or this case. Because of two reasons. The first reason is that you have not yet heard the evidence. And the second reason is that even if you happen to have specific knowledge about this case, through the media or whatever, at this point the law says that you are not allowed, at this point, to take account of that information. You have to put yourself in the framework of, I don't know anything here about this specific case. That's what the presumption of innocence says. So the question is what that does to this starting point. And I will get back to this later. So there has been some literature on this, and I will especially focus on two different ideas on how to interpret this starting point. The one I will call it's the 1 over n thesis, which is the idea that at this point you shall think of the probability of guilt as 1 over n, where n is the number of people who could have committed this act. So the defendant is 1 out of n people. And this is an approach that has been advocated by many. I think that the oldest where I have seen it, someone might correct me, is in an article by Dennis Lindley from 1977. Phil has written about it in a paper from 1993. The German influential authors Bender and Nack have this in their book, which is now in its 3rd or 4th edition. And there are also other people. So this is one solution that I will talk about that is problematic for a number of reasons that I will address. The other idea I will talk about is something that has been suggested by Richard Posner, who you might know. He's an American judge, famous advocate for a law and economics approach to all kinds of things. One of those is evidence. And Posner says that at that point, you should set the probability at 50-50. So that's Posner's idea. There are also other advocates of this approach. For instance, the Norwegian scholar Erling Eide, who you might know. And an interesting thing with these two approaches is that they differ fundamentally, in the sense that what Posner is doing is determining this probability normatively. So it's a legal rule that says, okay, now you should act as if this is the probability. He doesn't say that this is what you would actually believe in such a situation based on your world knowledge. It's what you should act as if this is the case. Whereas the other approach, as I understand it, is not a normative approach in that sense, but is a way for a fact finder to handle the world knowledge at that point. So it's not something that the law imposes. Okay.
Here you are talking, and I suspect this is for the whole of the talk, in terms of initial probabilities quantified on the hypothesis of guilt.
Yes. On the statement that the prosecutor makes of the criminal act itself. I mean, guilt can also involve other things. I mean, it could be that you're not guilty because it's whether this act, as stated by in charge, was committed. Yeah.
But there is an approach which is also explicitly embodied in some laws in this country, where you do not put an initial probability, but you simply take the statement presumed innocent until proved guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The presumed innocent plays the role of a null hypothesis in a hypothesis testing scenario. And then the evidence has to be shown to be incompatible with that to a degree which is so unlikely that you cannot believe the null hypothesis. And that's a totally different approach.
That's a different approach, yes, which I'm not talking about.
Yeah, but it is embodied near enough explicitly for certain crimes in this country.
Yes, it's all depends on how you understand what the lawyers say. The problem is that the lawyers are very vague on this. So, but could we maybe let that one aside since I'm not talking about that one? I mean, I don't say it's not relevant. We can talk about it later, but I'd like to go on with these approaches.
How is it that one has an outrageously huge presumption of guilt in many cases? For instance, if you find someone by database search.
Yeah.
It seems flagrantly too big.
Yeah, which I will come to if I can continue my talk. So, in this article by Lindley from 1977, he has this example where he says, okay, suppose a crime was committed in Britain, and then he says that, okay, then N is the population of the British Islands. Which is, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere around 64 million. Can that be correct?
It wasn't then.
Wasn't then, no. But I mean, I think in principle, that's his argument.
And that includes 2-year-olds as well.
Well, that is a problem that I will get to, yes. This is exactly one of the problems with this approach. But so that will mean that the initial probability will be 1 divided by n. So it's this number, very small probability. So there are a number of problems with this idea. Some of them have been pointed out before, others haven't, and I'd like to make you aware of them. Okay, the first one is that as some kind of general approach, it's problematic for the simple reason that it assumes that a crime has been committed. I mean, the whole idea of thinking about, okay, now the defendant is one of possible culprits is that that a crime has been committed. And there are, for example, there are many legal cases where it's not about who, but if. There are, for example, many rape cases where the defendant says, we had sex, but I didn't rape her. So it's not about who, it's about if this was a rape. So in those kinds of situations, this whole idea of 1 through n doesn't seem to work.
And in this country, there's the famous case of Tony Martin, which maybe I'll tell you about later.
Yes, that's a very good idea. The later idea, I like it. Hold on to the later idea. That's the best thing so far. Yeah. So, as you see from Lindy's example, there's this idea of crime of committed on the British Islands. So n is somehow determined by geographical area. Now, that seems to be problematic for the simple reason that it's arbitrary. I mean, if a crime was committed here in Cambridge yesterday, why exactly would you say that n is the population of the British Isles? Why couldn't you just as well say, well, it's the population of Cambridge, or Cambridgeshire, or England, or Europe? Why exactly the British Isles? I know, of course, from a British perspective, this is kind of a default position that the British Isles somehow define the world. But, I mean, if you would try to move away from that mind frame, it's completely arbitrary. And we had this problem in the case that we, the Dutch Simmelshofen case. that we reported about yesterday when we discussed this. The crime in the forest outside of Rotterdam. So Norman, for example, said, well, we have to ask how many people were in the forest. And I said, well, why exactly draw a line around the forest? Now that seems intuitively like a smart thing to do, because, I mean, you can visualize the forest as a delimited area, but if you think about it, that's just arbitrary. Why not say this part of the forest, or the recreational area where the forest was a part of? Why exactly the forest? That seems arbitrary. Yeah, he was murdered in Rotterdam as well. He was also murdered in the part of the forest where he was murdered, or she was murdered. Another probability that has pointed out is that if you base it on geographical area, then what will happen is that the population density of that area will influence the prior. So a crime committed in a highly populated area will have a lower prior. So that will mean that if I intend to murder someone, it's very stupid to do it in the north of Scotland. I should do it in London, because then there will be many other possible culprits. Yeah. Yeah, and that is, I mean, that's probabilistic, that is true. Yeah. Look at all the guys who are not lawyers who do this now, yeah? Yeah. Now, the guys in the room who are lawyers think about the different, wait a minute, because in the law we have an idea of a fair trial which postulates that defendants should be treated equally if there isn't a relevant reason for treating them differently. So if two burglars are prosecuted for the same offense, it seems reasonable that it shouldn't require more evidence to convict one than the other, just because they were committed in two different cities with different populations. That seems to be to many lawyers, Jaffe has made this argument, this violates the idea of equal treatment. So another problem is the over-inclusiveness. That's what you mentioned about the babies, right? So the population of the British Isles includes people who obviously couldn't have done it, like infants. So if you completely disregard ability to commit the crime, then you obviously get an over-inclusive number of n. So it seems that you need to start to think about ability. But as soon as you do that, you get into a whole range of other problems. So because, okay, ability, what's ability here? It's physical ability, it's knowledge. Maybe for some crimes you need some kind of psychic setup to be able to do it. You need some kind of special instrument, etc. So opening up that opens up a whole range of problems. And one of the problems that I actually just realized yesterday, because of my talks too, when I thought about what Richard and I had discussed, was that there actually seems to be some kind of paradox here. Because if we're supposed to determine n with regard to ability, at the beginning of a trial, before we have any specific knowledge about the defendant, or are allowed to consider any specific knowledge, what we're doing is that we're restricting this reference class with regard to ability, and then we're saying that, okay, now we've done that, and it's 1 million people or something, and 1 over n assumes that the defendant is a member of this reference class. Then we assume that the defender has those abilities, whatever they are, which we are not allowed at this point to assume. So this whole idea seems to be impossible.
I'm not sure that having the ability contradicts the presumption of innocence. I can be presumed innocent and have the ability.
Yeah, but if ability means that you must, for example, have knowledge about explosives and stuff like that. Then you would say, okay, that does seem to go with the presumption of innocence, that we assume that this guy has knowledge of explosives before evidence has been presented about it. So this seems to be really problematic. And then there is also a robustness problem here. Because this whole ability business is something that we have very bad knowledge about as legal decision makers. And it's not something that there is even evidence presented about in trial. If I am on a jury and I sit at the beginning of the trial and I'm supposed to restrict now the reference class with regard to the ability, then I'm supposed to think, okay, but how many people in Great Britain or Cambridge have knowledge about explosives? I have no idea. That whatever number I come up with there is going to be very unrobust. And that is a big problem from a legal point of view, because robustness is actually a legal requirement for convicting someone in a criminal trial. This is something that has been hugely overlooked in the literature, mainly because people who do criminal evidence don't understand about robustness and that kind of thing. But actually, if you see it from a probabilistic view, you can actually see that the standard of proof is a double standard. So there are actually two things that must be met in order to convict someone in a criminal trial. So the first thing is that the probability of guilt, given the evidence presented at the trial, must meet the standard of proof. I here have P star, which whatever value that is, 99% or something. But that's not enough. Because there are some trials where a judge will say that this case has there are so many questions that are unasked here. There are witnesses that haven't been heard, tests that should have been sent to the lab that haven't been sent to the lab. There are so many avenues that haven't been pursued. So the stuff that I have been presented is so incomplete with regard to all the possible evidence that even if, according to this stuff, it's very probable that the defendant is guilty, I will have to acquit because it's not robust enough. Or what I could say is that if I had, Q here stands for more knowledge, then the probability that the first assessment will stand, given more knowledge, is isn't high enough to convict. So what you see here is that it's a first order probability and a second order probability. The first order probability is the probability of guilt given what we know, and the second order probability is the probability that this assessment would still stand, would hold, if we would know more of the stuff that would know the answers to questions that haven't been asked. This is, and these two, the first and second order probability, is something that I think has been hugely overlooked in criminal evidence literature. It has been discussed. I think the first one who talked about these things were Peirce. You can correct me if I'm wrong. The year is not when he talked about it, because he was dead then, but the year when his collected papers were published. Keynes talked about the second order probability as the weight of the evidence, if you remember, which is confusing because nowadays people often talk about the first order probability as the weight of the evidence. And this is a thing that has been discussed under various names. It's been discussed as the completeness of the evidence, the resilience of the evidence, the probability of surprise, by whole other stuff here. I've written about it as well with some colleagues from Lund. And this is a general problem for all kinds of evidence, but it seems to be particularly problematic for the assumptions that go into ability and that stuff we discussed before, because it's stuff that where the robustness is typically very low. So I have a case, we will have two kinds of acquittal. This is what I just said. The first one is when the probability the defendant is guilty, given the evidence presented, is not sufficient for a conviction. Then the first condition fails. And the other one, the robustness situation, lack of robustness, the probability that the defendant is guilty, given the evidence presented in court, is sufficient. So that one is met. But the probability that this would prevail in the light of additional information is not sufficient for a conviction.
Can I suggest a minor modification of your last formula, where you put the conditioning on Q together with the E? There's only one conditioning going on. Conditioning of the evidence you've got and the evidence you're hypothesizing. It's a first order probability, but with additional unanswered questions. Put it there with uncertain answers.
Yeah, that might be right. Yeah, I'm very helpful for those suggestions because I'm not a mathematician. But
I was wondering if the E on the bottom line should not have been E and Q because it's
That's right. That's what I suggested.
That's the order.
that's probably right. Thanks. What you of course have in both cases here is also world knowledge that you have to add, because that is what makes a certain type of Q relevant in some cases and others not, because we have some kind of world knowledge about what kind of investigations typically generate relevant information. So that makes it more problematic. So just to take a simple example of this robustness problem, suppose you have here, this is an arsenic case. Someone has set light to a bus here in London, and just for the sake of argument, let us suppose here that the likelihood ratio of the evidence pointing to the defendant is 10,000, and that we have a standard of proof that says that you have to arrive at 97% as the ultimate posterior probability. Then I could say, well, okay, how many people are there in London who have the ability to do something like this? And ability counting in also that they have that they are pyromaniacs in a psychological sense as well as in the knowledge sense. And suppose that I set that number at 100 as a euro. That would give a posterior probability given the likelihood ratio of 99. Whereas if I would say, now wait a minute, I mean London is a big city, maybe there are 1,000 guys in London who could have done this. Then suddenly it becomes 91%. And as you can see here, this is enough to convict, but this is not enough to convict. So it's completely crucial here what I assume here. So this kind of case would create a problematic situation where I say that, okay, if I can do two things here. I can either assume 100, then the first condition, the standard of proof, is met, but then I will have to say, well, wait a minute, this 100, it was based on very scant knowledge about my number of pyromaniacs in London. If we would have had evidence about that, it's quite probable that that might change, go up and down. Maybe it would go to 1,000, and in that case, we would need to acquit. So the probability that this would stand additional inquiries is not high enough to convict. Or I could say, well, in order to not get myself into this old robustness problem, let's be very conservative back here. So we assume a very low prior, so that won't happen. Well, then it will fail on the first condition. So whatever I do, I will need to acquit in this case. And I think it will seem unsatisfactory if there were a lot of cases like this, where especially where judges would say something like, well, actually the evidence that we have seems good enough, but we don't know enough about pyromaniacs to convict, so therefore we have to acquit. I mean, that wouldn't go very well with the public, right? So, another solution to this thing is to determine the initial probability normatively instead. So instead of going with the 1 over n thing, simply say, okay, let's say that the law determines the initial probability. It puts the thumb on the scale, the law decides a number. That number doesn't correspond to anything in scientific, it's just a legally decided number, just as other numbers in the law are. I think in the US, to be president, you have to be 40, right? It's just, the law just says it, it's not based on anything else. We just have to follow that number.
IQ.
So everyone over 40 has IQ that's high enough. No, but I mean, whatever you think about it, even if you think it's wrong, yeah. Well, I'm resisting the temptation to make a Trump joke at this point.
It's already been made.
Exactly, that's why I'm not doing it. And that could be 1% or 50% as opposed to supposed. That could be any. I mean, the law can command anything. Because what would happen then is that all these problems that I just talked about go away. They all just go away. All the problems with the 1 over n. The problem with that it doesn't fit the situations of where it's not who but if, no problem, because the law says that in an if situation, did he rape her or not, we start with whatever initial probability the law says. Easy. The whole business with determining a certain geographical area disappears because there's no geographical area to determine. The whole problem of ability, the paradox, the robustness, it all goes away. There's no robustness problem anymore, because since the law says where you should start, it doesn't matter what information you would have. You can have all the other information in the world at the later stage. You would still be constrained by the law to start at a certain point. So this seems to be quite a strong reason to determine it, the initial probability normatively. And of course, now we have to stop for a moment and think, what does that mean? Well, that means that the legal probability, every consecutive probability, including the last posterior, are not actual probabilities in an unconstrained sense, but they are legal probabilities, determined not only by what we observe about the world, but also the constraints that the law sets on the specific legal situation of fact-finding. And we already have that in other rules. So it's not something that will be novel to this kind of rule. We have it in all rules, legal rules, that forbid a legal decision maker to consider certain information. All rules of inadmissibility, if we have a rule like you have in the US, for example, that says that you cannot use prior conviction as evidence of guilt, taking apart some cases, rape cases and so, but in most cases, what that means is that whatever probability assessment the decision maker comes up with would be different than the one that he or she would privately come up with, where you would take account of that information because you're allowed to do it. Because if you're just a spectator at a criminal trial, or you're sitting in this room and doing science, you are not constrained by the law. You are freely assessing all kinds of evidence. But as a legal decision maker, that's not the case. You are constrained by the law. So that also means that we talked about this also a lot at the other seminar a month ago, that you have these situations where, as a legal decision maker, you can say that, okay, privately, given all the information I have and freely using them, I think that the probability that this guy is guilty is 90% or something. But acting in the role as a legal decision maker, and thereby being constrained in certain ways by legal rules, which forbid me to take account of certain information that I do have access to, it's only 70%. or whatever. And so that you would have this, you have two probabilities. One is your personal genuine belief of the probability, and the other one is the one that you, in your role as a legal decision maker, has to act as if were the case. So the whole law is a game, a pretend game, where you have to act as if. Which makes law different from private decisions on whether to take an umbrella if you see that it's cloudy in the morning, or doing science, because all those enterprises are free. There's nothing that constrains us in our probability assessment. But in the law there actually is. There are a lot of inadmissibility rules, and if the initial probability is understood as something that's normatively set, that's just another one of those constraints which make the legal probability something different than the unconstrained probability.
Why you also have the ethics?
Because you can imagine other normative systems that would have the same effect. I could, let's say for example that you would have a system of ethics, it could either be the personal or social, that for instance says that it's unethical of me to draw any conclusions about people based on skin color. So I therefore refrain from doing that. So when I meet a person, although I would say, okay, my knowledge of the world says that given this person's skin color, something is more probable because of that skin color than if he had a different skin color. But I'm going to say, I'm not going to think about that. I am mentally putting that aside because I want to be an ethical person. I act now under a normative system where that forbids me to draw any inference on that. An ethical system that says, okay, I have to learn more about this person. I cannot, I don't want to draw any racist conclusions. So in that kind of situation, you would have a similar thing going on. And I think we do that all the time. So, yes. 1 divided by 2 minutes, yeah. So, very quickly, Posner's idea with the 50-50. I don't want to talk a lot about that as I've been criticized. As Friedman has said in an article, this does not go with the presumption of innocence. Because the presumption of innocence doesn't say that it's equally probable that the defendant is guilty or innocent. It sets a way too high standard. And I think it confuses two things, actually. It confuses impartiality in the sense that you should be open to evidence, which is one thing, with the idea that the presumption of innocence would be 50-50, which is another thing. So, how shall then the initial probability be determined? Well, that's a moral question. That's not a scientific question. Should it be 1%, 10%, 5%, whatever? There's no scientific answer to this question. This question can only be answered morally by weighing the cost, disutility, or whatever you like to call it, of wrongful convictions against the cost of wrongful acquittals. That's what gives you the answer to that question. How much worse is it that an innocent person gets convicted than a guilty person gets off? And that is another story, so therefore I am here. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Surely the 1 over n prior, notwithstanding the idea that the null hypothesis might be a way of doing it, from a Bayesian perspective, surely the 1 over n prior is the closest to the legal constraint of presumed innocent, because it can't be 0. And in actual fact, if you take that prior and simply consider all of those things that you talked about as being problems, whether it's ability, whether it, all those types of things, they're simply evidence, right?
Indeed.
They're evidence, and you just put that in. And once you've got all that, you provide that evidence, your n comes, that number comes down. And even counting your thing about whether the crime took place or not, that's just another unknown hypothesis.
But
that's fine as well.
no, it isn't, because we are now at a point in time, at the beginning of a criminal trial, where there is no evidence. The evidence has not yet been presented, and if you happen to have personal information, you're not allowed to think about it. So the question is, at that point in time, we're freezing time at the moment when the prosecution has stated the charge, the criminal act, and no evidence has been presented. So at that time, you're not allowed, if you want to say, what is the legal probability at that point in time, it's not allowed, it can only take account of general information about the world. It cannot take account of any specific information. And that creates this paradox that I talked about. Because if you do the 1 over n thing, you are placing the defendant in a reference class of where you're not allowed to place him, because you don't know that he belongs to that class yet. No, not if you if you do it with the whole world population, yes.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There should be the whole world population.
But then you have the problem of over-inclusiveness.
No, that's evidence. Just take your example. Yeah, you over-inclusive because you shouldn't include 2-year-old kids, right? Do you then say when it comes to a 14-year-old, you've got to get rid of all 14-year-olds? Or maybe a 14-year-old could have done it. That's evidence. You've got to then provide evidence that it couldn't have been done by a 14-year-old. Right? Everything's evidence. And
Let's move on. Yes.
I've got a follow-up on that. A follow-up on that. It's the kind of same issue, but so if we accept what you've said, but then we do want to take account of evidence like capability, opportunity. On your proposal, let's say we want to estimate the likelihood ratio, we're going to end up having to encounter exactly the same problems that you mentioned about robustness, and we need evidence. So to me, it just defers the problem rather than solves the problem.
The robustness argument.
Well, no, what I mean is your argument against using the prior of, let's say, a population or something. Your arguments against that will now reappear when you want to use things like capability evidence or opportunity evidence. You're going to have the same, because you're going to consider the probability of the capability given that they didn't do it. So I feel that I've got a sense you're shunting the problems later on, and that might be okay for you because you want to start with a normative thing, but the problems are still going to reappear, and if we solve them, or at least address them, then would you be happy with that, or are you still, do you think they're just problems just if you're doing the prior, or do you think they're problems if you use this as evidence anyway?
I think the robustness problem is not specific to the initial probability. You will have that all the time.
So the same.
But if you look at the reality of how a legal trial works, it will be more acute to stuff that there's no evidence presented about. I mean, in an arson trial, there is no evidence about the number of pyromaniacs that are around.
Yeah, but if you say this guy's a pyromaniac, we know, and therefore we're going to commit him. We say no, there's loads of pyromaniacs. And just because he's a pyromaniac doesn't mean he's guilty. But obviously, if he's the only pyromaniac that there's ever been, then that's more suggestive. So it feels like that is evidence. And then you question the robustness, and that's what.
There are lots of people itching to get their word in. I'm not going to be able to take them all. Bill?
I worry you might have misconceived the notion of presumption of innocence. I mean, I've always thought of it a bit differently. I mean, I think what the presumption of innocence means, as I read the American case law, is a commitment to draw no conclusions at all from the mere fact that the person has been charged, right? So it's a commitment, as you said, to set aside certain kinds of evidence and consider only the evidence that's presented during the trial procedure itself, and to draw no conclusions at all from anything prior to that being presented. If you ask the juror going into the trial what's your prior probability, the properly instructed juror would say, well, I have no way of knowing. I can't. I'm agnostic. I can draw no conclusion until I hear the first piece of evidence in the trial. And the first piece of evidence might be, well, a woman was raped. Semen was found at the scene. The defendant is a man. All of a sudden, now that rules out a significant percentage of the population. Now I can start thinking about probabilities. But I've drawn no conclusions about probabilities before being confronted with the evidence that's presented at the trial itself, and then I begin it. And at that point, I think, implicitly the prior is going to be 1 over world's population, but you're then very quickly partitioning the population based on the evidence, and then I think it's sensible to think about it in that manner.
Well, the presumption of innocence says a whole lot of things. I think it's the presumption of innocence this is just one thing that the presumption of innocence says. I mean, if you single out that, okay, you're not allowed to take account of the fact that he's under prosecution, that's not everything that the presumption of innocence says. I mean, if you look,
but
if you look at, I mean, there are whole lots of other things, for example, that we haven't even talked about here. That the whole setup of a trial is such that the defendant is treated during the trial as if he were innocent, for example, in other respects, the right to counsel, etc., and stuff like that. So it seems like, I mean, the presumption of innocence is really an umbrella for a whole bunch of things. It's not just one thing.
Except for prior probability.
Well, according to you.
Hey, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw to a close now. Sorry, I know people want to talk. Can I just say one thing? I can't resist quoting from Robert Bolt's screenplay to A Man for All Seasons, one of my favourite quotes, when Thomas More is on trial for his life and is asked, what does his silence betoken? And he says, well, how will the world construe your silence? And his answer is, this is the difference between personal and legal probability. The world will construe according to its wits, but this court must construe according to the law.
Yes.
Thank you.